All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us to the InScope podcast. My name is John Scott. I'm one of the founders of ScopeStack, and I'm pleased to have with me here today Skip Tappen. So a little bit of background on Skip. Skip's been in the IT services industry for about 30 plus years now. He was previously the CEO of NWN. And over the past 4 years, has just been a great mentor to myself and the team in terms of how, talking about IT services and building great business. So Skip, thank you for joining us. And
excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for joining remotely. And again, as I mentioned, just you and I have had a lot of conversations like this in the past, but happy to bring this to our podcast listeners. And really, I just want to start with the foundational elements of an IT services company, right? And so that's something that you've been doing for a long time. And I know you have some wisdom you can impart here on this podcast.
Well, I think as we talked about, right, the fundamentals of an IT service organization, you've got three fundamental components, really, if you think about it, is you need to go sell the service, right? You need the pre-sales team to then help you kind of scope the service and make sure you get it right. And then you have the service delivery team, which is then responsible for executing on what was scoped out.
Yeah, exactly. And so again, my background was always on the pre-sales side, right? Not until we started ScopeStack did I realize how hard sales was. And I always knew how hard the delivery side was because those guys and girls were just smarter than I was in general. So I always knew, those two things were difficult. But maybe just because you built your business over a long period of time, did you start with sales, pre-sales, delivery, or did you start with a combination of the two? Like where does someone start, I guess, if we're starting to talk about the foundation?
Yeah, as an individual in the organization, you mean? So I grew up from the engineering side myself, right? And I think a lot of times it kind of depends on who you are. But I think, pre-sales, the ideal pre-sales solution architect type engineer has a great kind of mix of sales capabilities and communicate to the customer and be able to translate, right, customer requirements to what actually has to be delivered, right, combined with having a technical competency, right, to then understand how to scope the project properly and be able to talk with the engineers about what needs to get done. So my past, I think, experience is some of the best pre-sales engineers we had typically actually came more out of the engineering side, but had a bent to be able to actually get in front of customers and sell.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, right? Like, so I was going to ask you, and having been a part of these organizations, growing them, finding pre-sales it's a difficult role to fill in my experience, right? Because to your point, you can find people that may know the technical side. You can even find people that don't know the technical side and can talk to people. But right, to blend those two together, I had it one time described as like a Jedi Knight, right? It's a unique individual that can do both, right? And can you kind of speak to?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you have is, and I think all three roles, quite honestly, are unique because I've had pre-sales engineers that thought sales was easy and went over there and realized sales isn't so easy either.
Learned it,
right?
Yes, right.
And, it takes a special person to be that salesperson that can qualify the lead, understand what's required, do the follow-ups. But then that, the secret sauce of the pre-sales engineer who can actually then take those requirements, configure it properly, but then actually translate it back to the customer so they understand what you're selling. And quite honestly, that one of the key roles, at least that I've seen, right, is the pre-sale is instilling confidence in the customer that we know what's going on and we know how to get it done, right? I mean, it's all about at that point, and that's why that's the selling piece, in my opinion, of the pre-sales engineer. They're instilling that confidence, right, and that we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because the relationships. So you go into a client engagement. The sales executive, sales leaders typically owning the overall relationship, right, with the main point of contact, so on and so forth. That pre-sales engineer has the opportunity to come in and establish a relationship at a completely different level, and sometimes the more impactful level, right? So they're the ones that are bringing that trust and that credibility into the engineering conversation, and so I just think it's it's always really interesting. How do you handle all of that in a single meeting, and how do you build that relationship?
I think the classic comment by most sales folks is, all right, I'll let the smart guy or the smart person, start talking now. So, they've married the customer with the appropriate resource, which in itself is important, right?
Sure.
Because want to get the right pre-sales engineer in there. But once that's done, then they turn it over to the pre-sales engineer to really kind of
Yeah.
work it out. I mean, I had one pre-sales engineer I worked with all the time, and his favorite thing was going up to the whiteboard. Right? 'Cause it was all
Yeah.
about getting up there in front of the customer, asking the questions, doing the design, whiteboarding it out with the customer, and that level of engagement at a real detailed, granular level. He loved to do it, and the customers just ate it up.
Yeah, I think I carried around expo markers with me everywhere I went. Right, I think I just found some in a bag the other day, and I was like, "Oh man, I used to draw on the board. Now I just do that for my kids." Right, so it's completely different use case.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Although you're typically selling to kids, also, it's just a different
Yeah.
different message.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, I almost went on a tangent there. So 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 say I'm a new MSP, I'm a new VAR, I'm building out my go-to-market team. Typically, it starts with a salesperson, right? Like I need someone to go sell. When have you found is there a right time to bring in a pre-sales person, or can you kind of walk me through like how you've
right? So yeah, I think where the challenge is, most startup service organizations I've seen where you typically have is you don't have a dedicated pre-sales engineer in the small organization.
right?
What you have is one of your key engineers can actually also do the pre-sales component.
Engineer being the guy or girl responsible for doing the work, the delivery
delivering,
work.
yeah.
They're coming in.
Well, because a full-time pre-sales engineers, that's a costly investment.
Sure.
Now, there's a lot of impact to it, but if you're just kind of getting going in the first place, it's difficult to justify that level of cost. So at least my experience is what you typically do in the beginning as you're building out the team and scaling up the team is leveraging your engineers to help you do, if you can get the right one or two engineers that can wear multiple hats.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is they're playing dual roles in the beginning, which is tough because then you're always, it's feast or famine.
Right.
Right.
Well, I mean, I guess that's what I was going to ask is, okay, so you have engineers doing delivery work, right? They're delivering these projects you just sold. Like, is it a purely financial decision as to when to bring in a pre-sales person? Is it based on workload of that engineering team? Like, how would you evaluate when to insert pre-sales on your team?
Yeah, we had it was an age-old debate we had early on. I was very resistant to dedicated pre-sales myself because of the cost component of it.
Sure.
Right. The engineering team was all over me about, wearing the multiple hats was really just wearing on them. Right. Because you couldn't focus on one or the other. Right. And if you're in pre-sales mode, great. But all of a sudden, if a customer situation blows up, guess what happens? You got to pivot to delivery because that's you got to get that right. So to me, at the end of the day, it's a balance between making sure you're taking care of your engineers and also that you can financially afford doing it.
Yeah.
But if you can get there, it's an ideal situation to have the ability to have dedicated pre-sales.
Yeah. And again, like the impact, right, is what? Closing more deals, closing them faster, closing larger deals. Like what are you looking for?
Yes, and yes.
All of it, right? All of it.
Yeah. I mean, we found, I've told you this in the past, right? We found that the more time we were able to free up of our pre-sales engineer to spend with the customer was a direct correlation with the amount of business we closed.
Wow.
Right. So, we get salespeople driving stuff to the top of the funnel, but if you get those solution architects in front of the customer, it just had a multiplying effect in terms of actually converting it to business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what I'm gathering and also talking to other services, like there's no one right answer, right? It's all dependent on your business, your trajectory, how you're growing, so on and so forth. Like there are a lot of factors in it too. But I think the big one, like that you just mentioned, is regardless of the business, and again, a good qualified pre-sales engineer, like there's a direct impact to how much business you're going to close if that guy or girl is a part of the conversation.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, again, as you said, we had some of our salespeople that have been doing it for a long time who were quite technical.
Yeah.
So they actually could carry the conversation pretty far sometimes as well. So it's kind of that, the mix between those three parts of the organization, right? And it kind of bleeds left or right, more towards a salesperson can do it, more towards you require an engineer to do it, depending on the the skills of the individuals, right, in your actual team.
Right.
So sometimes you can lean more heavily on the salesperson if they got a lot of experience and are technically oriented. Sometimes they're actually a really light touch, right, because they're really just about a relationship, and they got to lean much more heavily on the technical skills of the pre-sales team, and then sometimes all the way to the engineering team.
So as you just mentioned, like it's a bleed over, right? Like it's not these silos of sales, pre-sales, post-sales. Ideally, it's not a silo. Like someone that has led a large organization, like how do you make sure that those three very critical teams are aligned and working together? Like how do you navigate that as a leader in a business?
Well, I think you don't. There's the balance between creating barriers between them, because you don't want that, right? You want a fluid motion between them, but also understanding each group's roles and responsibilities, right? And for us, and what I've seen others do is it's the workflow that you create and the processes you define. Where are the handoffs between the three groups, right? And at the end of the day, I think what I've seen is that the biggest challenges are in the handoffs. So, you'd love to have one person that literally could do everything, because then you don't have to deal with any handoffs. You don't have to deal with any lapse in communications, any gaps in terms of, the customer comes to the delivery engineer and says, well, the salesperson said we could do this, right? Right. The classic line, that's the result of requiring different people to be involved. Yeah. Right. But inevitably you need multiple people involved. So now it's about how you make sure you got a good flow of who to engage when, and you have good handoffs between the different individuals.
Yeah, I always explained, the role of pre-sales is bridging the gap between sales and delivery. Coming in and, okay, I hear what you want, and I hear what we told you we could do in probably the first conversation, but here's what we can actually do, right, in terms of delivery. Right. So, it's always this, and it's a balance.
I was going to say, we told our sales team, right, two things, right? Classic quote in the sales world is never confuse selling with delivery.
Right. I've heard that one.
Right. So salesperson's initial reaction is always yes.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what it is. Yes. Right.
Right.
And you actually want them that way, quite frankly, because you need to get the customer engaged. But it's a yes, but, or it's a yes, however, or it's a yes, but you got to lead with, right, you want to be positive in what you're actually doing, right? That, as you said, it's the solution architect's job to then bridge that to what you really can do when you get down to the details.
Yeah. Well, so walking through a traditional sales motion, right? So sales is out there drumming up some top of the funnel deals. They're more than likely meeting with the client for the first time, right? Because there are potentially not enough pre-sales people to go around. Right. So there's a mix of like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or whatnot.
Yep.
So sales out there, top of funnel, they have the first client conversation. Like what would you suggest from that conversation to then getting a pre-sales person involved? Like what is sales? You mentioned not deal flow. You mentioned handoff. Like what does sales need to bring to that pre-sales engineer to equip them for the second meeting? Is it as simple as like a meeting?
Yeah, good question. We actually, I totally understand the question. Right. We kind of flipped it around the other way. When you can get good at it is, what does the pre-sales engineer provide to the salesperson, right? So that they have, what they call a questionnaire or some pre-qualifications, or so what we were trying to do is the pre-sales team tried to educate the sales team on these are the things, when you come talk to me, these are the 10 questions I want you to have answered first.
Yeah.
Right? Because as you said, what we're trying to do, the pre-sales team is limited in typically the number of resources you have. So you really only want them working on truly qualified leads, ideally, right? Yeah. So what we try to do is actually push as much into the sales team's hands with questionnaires and the like, right? Such that when they do come, they have as much of the scope understood as possible. So because there's two things with that, right? Especially if you have multiple pre-sales or solution architects, you want to make sure you get the right one. So they got to understand enough of the scope of this thing, right? Is it a network upgrade, right? Is it a wireless assessment, right? Is it a data center refresh, right? What is it, and kind of some of the details, right?
Right. So a very practical example. I go into a meeting, I'm meeting with the client, they want to do a wireless survey, right? Typically, to your point, like I would have some sort of questionnaire, or like I have a resource that I can look up and say, okay, I need to answer these questions so that I can, one, speed this conversation along, but also and internally qualify the opportunity and get the right pre-sales engineer involved at the right time. Right.
Yep.
So in the example of wireless survey, I might need like square footage. I might need facility type, like what kinds of applications are they going to run on that environment? And more than likely that was a list of questions that either pre-sales or even delivery crafted and said, hey, before we deliver the solution, you need to ask these questions. Is that
exactly right?
Yeah. Okay.
Classic. And as you think about it, the more you can empower the sales team in the front of the process by leveraging questionnaires and the like from your delivery team or your pre-sales team,
yeah,
the better, right? Quite frankly. So a best practice, in my opinion, is around driving towards sales enablement. Because the more enabled they are, then the further down the funnel they can take it, the more qualified it becomes before you then need to engage with the truly technical resources.
Right.
But then once you really know it's qualified, you do want to pivot quick, because then you want to get the technical resources in front of the customer to instill that level of confidence that we can actually get this thing delivered.
Yeah. Well, and I have a ton of questions around a comment you made, which is you have to make sure you're getting the right pre-sales resource, right? So
yeah,
pre-sales engineers are typically very smart people, very qualified. However, no one...
If you do say so yourself.
I mean, I wasn't. No, I was not. I know some very technical people, right? Very deep. But the point being is like, I could generally speak about a lot of stuff, but even in a pre-sale, like I couldn't go super deep in, I don't know, FlexPod or name something, right? That is new and advanced, right? So as a pre-sales leader or as a leader of an organization, you're always trying to find this balance, right? Of technical depth and skills on the pre-sales team even, right? Like, I don't know about y'all, but we used to have like a heat map, right? Hey, rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 across all these practice areas. Like there are a lot of things you can do just to identify where your pre-sales team might be weak in a certain technology type or something like that. So did y'all do something similar?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely, and we to your point is actually we tried to have all the pre-sales engineers know a little bit about all of our solutions.
Sure.
Because sometimes, depending on how far the salesperson can take it, you may have to start with a certain pre-sales engineer because the one with the depth isn't available. So you want to keep keep momentum going. But then so they know a little bit, but ultimately, as you said, it's either through a heat map and or quite frankly, the sales team starts to know which pre-sales engineers they want in their meeting. So you get those kind of things going on as well.
Oh yeah, all the time, and then you start to ask yourself, why do they keep getting Joe? Like, why does everyone keep wanting to work with Joe? What's so great about Joe? Why not John? Not that I've had that experience, no. but right, like there are all sorts of nuance to how do you staff that team? How do you make sure they're getting involved in meetings?
Oh yeah,
and you mentioned a
we used
stat.
to go. Go ahead, yeah.
So you mentioned a stat of you close 60% more deal. You had a number, I thought, or some sort of metric that used to, if pre-sales was involved.
Yeah, well, we used to be able, we would track. So, relative to the pre-sales team to try to get understanding we actually had our pre-sales team, which they never really liked, but we asked them to do it anyway, and they complied. Was actually track their time. We kind of had in 3 big buckets, right? One was 3 or 4, right? Time in front of the customer, time documenting, the opportunity, whether it's creation of the SOW, configuring it, estimating it, and then internal time, meetings and all that kind of garbage, right? And our goal, and garbage only in terms of if you're a solution architect, that just feels like a total waste of time.
That's not why I laughed.
Unfortunately, I know
that's
there's
exactly
just
why I
some
laughed.
required there, right? But with that said. And our goal was to continuously figure out ways to drive down amount of time that they had to do internal activities and drive down the amount of time that they had to do the documentation and creation of the SOW and all that stuff, right? Such that therefore, so the time that's remaining, and it was therefore they got to spend more time in front of the customer And when they got to spend more time in front of the customer, as I said earlier, it was then directly related to business being closed.
Right.
So our metric was all around, one of set of metrics was all around how to do that. And so the reason they complied with the time bid is because they understood we were using that to try to make
Sure.
It better.
Yeah.
Right. And so to measure it helps us make it better. I think some would argue, not sure how well we did at that, but we were always working on it.
Right. Yeah. You got to measure it somehow.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm a big fan of that, but unfortunately it does require, data entry at some point to a certain extent. So
it does.
Right,
and go ahead.
I was going to say, so just to kind of wrap up those three tiers. So sales, pre-sales, post-sales. Now that we have an opportunity, we potentially won this let's say we won this opportunity, right? Pre-sales was involved, like that transition now, like where there's always the friction, and I think you mentioned this, is in between these three handoffs, right? So now what do I need to hand off from pre-sales to post-sales? Like what have you seen be effective when you start making that handoff?
Yeah, well, it all, in my opinion, the cornerstone of that is the statement of work. I mean, that, right? So you're trying to do, what's that?
So great answer. Great answer.
It is. As I've talked before. One of the reasons I was excited about ScopeStack, just for a little plug, was because it helps address some of these fundamental things. But
sure,
put that to the side for a minute. It really is the more that's in the statement of work, because basically my experience is you have a meeting, right? In the meeting, all three people are there. First, we had an internal kickoff meeting, we called it, and then a customer-facing kickoff meeting.
Right. Yep.
And the internal kickoff meeting was sales and the solution architect handing off to the project manager and the delivery engineer. Okay, this is everything we promised, basically. Right.
And
there's the amount of time we estimated for it.
Right.
Right, the work. This is the scope, et cetera, et cetera. So you had that going on, and obviously it's an opportunity for the delivery team, project manager, and engineers to ask all their questions before they get in front of the customer.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing more, in my opinion, embarrassing than when they then do the external meeting, if the delivery team's asking questions that they should have known the answers to.
Right. And granted, like that is a difficult handoff, right? Because there's a lot of information up to that point, and trying to distill the important stuff from the noise and hand that off in a clean, concise way is very difficult. But I mean, again, just to clarify, it's like the bill of materials, it's a statement of work, it's a work breakdown with level of effort calculations. Like those are the three kind of core pieces, right? But then
exactly, right. And I was going to say nuances to that. What if it's a multi-site delivery? Right. So now you got to break it down by what scope of work is happening in which site. Right. There's another potential complexity. So yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, and I think you're right. In fairness to the individuals involved, it's tough, and especially if it was an extended pre-sales process.
Right.
Because if it was, the longer that goes on, the more information that's being handed over by the customer, which now has to be passed on right to the delivery team.
So, all right. So to kind of bring this full circle, I really want to get your advice on someone that's been doing this for a very long time. Sales, pre-sales, post-sales. Like what is something practical that a VAR and MSP could be doing, whether it's just focused on the pre-sales side or sales? Like what would be one thing that you would call out based on this conversation, your experience doing it for a long time, that you felt to be the most impactful to your business?
Boiling it down to one, I must admit, but
you go two.
I'll start with one, and maybe a couple of things that, based on what we just covered, right?
Right. Yes.
And one of them, there was a transformation for us, and I think it did help us in terms of trying to figure out where we were. Was actually asking the solution architects to track their time and what they're spending. And again, not level of granularity, but just in big buckets, so you understand what's going on. Because that then you can understand, right? In order to try to improve, I'm a big believer in data, and data helps you understand. Make sure you're solving the right problem. Right. I think the other one we talked about also is if you don't have a formal handoff process, you should formalize it, right? And make sure those meetings happen, and also make sure that everybody attends,
Attendance.
Right.
Isn't key.
So we had times where, the salesperson happened to be just too busy, right? So we started enforcing and requiring and following up to make sure that we had these kickoff meetings, that everyone's supposed to be there is there, so it's actually productive, right? And people aren't blowing them off. So it's probably two. Focus on the handoffs, right, and measure some of the key components.
That's awesome. Well, Skip, thank you as always. Just ton of wisdom, actually having worked in this industry, and I know you have a lot to offer our podcast listeners. So thank you for joining us on this call today.
I appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find you in the universe if they ever want to have a conversation with you or reach out? Are you on LinkedIn, MySpace?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, I am on LinkedIn, and I do a check occasionally.
Yes. All right. Well, great. Well, again, Skip, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for everyone for joining us on the InScope podcast. You can find more about the podcast at scopestack.io/podcast. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.